Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar series today. We are excited to have you here as part of the Pathlock Innovation Series. Our presentation right now is with Protiviti on SOD risk quantification, how companies quantify financial exposure from SOD access to eliminate manual controls and save time. Our presenter today will be John Scaramucci, Associate Director of Business Application Solutions at Protiviti, and he will go ahead and introduce himself in just a moment.
Thank you, Stephanie. And hi, everyone. Stephanie mentioned my name is John Scaramucci, Associate Director with Protiviti. I support our SAP Security and Access Management pillar of the Business Application Solutions practice in the Northeast region, as well as support the Pathlock partnership nationally and more recently globally as well. And I specialized in this concept of SOD risk quantification for several years, and I've helped a lot of our clients with this particular solution. So I'm definitely really excited to talk to you all today about this. The agenda is going to be to first kind of introduce some of the concepts quickly. I think everyone's on the call should hopefully be familiar with SOD, but we'll introduce this concept of quantification and dive into how a lot of companies that I've worked with have tackled this and some of the best practices that they've used, as well as look at some case studies of specific examples of how this has been implemented, and then talk about building a business case and kind of what the next steps might be for your organization. So with that, I'll jump into it. I'm going to turn my camera off so you can focus on some of the slides and see you again at the end of the presentation. So an introduction to this concept of quantifying SOD risk. So what is a segregation of duties risk? I think we're all familiar with the concept, but if not, we'll level set right now. An SOD is a conflict that's created when a user in an application or across applications has access to perform two or more different business functions that present a risk to the company. And the risk could be financial or operational in nature, just something that you want to separate access between an individual. And you typically monitor all of these different types of risks using a rule set that has rankings like high, medium, low, or critical. And to monitor these risks in an application like SAP takes a lot of processing power and specific skill set and expertise. So most companies use a GRC tool like SAP Access Control to analyze their SAP environment for SODs. In this example on the screen, this particular user has two different roles, which are made up of various elements like T-codes and authorization objects. One role giving her the ability to create vendor records, and the other the ability to create invoices. So this is a classic example of a business risk and a SOX compliance risk on many levels. And the question we might ask if this kind of conflict is found is, what is the exposure financially, right? So if we were to go try to quantify this risk with just this information, we might end up getting ourselves into something like this, where we're basically looking to see what are all the invoices that this particular user posted. And this is a massive undertaking, right? We have to pull a lot of data and try to understand what exactly occurred or what was performed by this user. And if we want to take it a step further, we can try to slice up all of that data into specific scenarios. So is it something that's over a certain dollar amount? Can we dissect this data based on certain criteria? And chunk it up basically to tackle it, but we still end up having a massive amount of different scenarios to look at. Different ways things are processed. Is this invoice going through a verification process? Is it direct entry? Is there approval? Is it uploaded with Windshuttle or something like this? And we still end up with a big bucket that we probably have to look into further because we're not sure what they mean. So this takes us to what we want to talk about today, which is there other criteria we can look at to find meaningful results within that giant stack of transactions? So an actual violation of an SOD would be where someone's actually carried out the specific risk scenario that's presented by the defined segregation of duties, in the previous example. So if we're looking at a different user, specifically, what did they do with this access? We'd be looking for instances of where they actually maintained a record for a specific vendor ABC here, for example, and entered an invoice for that vendor ABC. So we're considering, the sequence of when this happens, right? If they were to enter an invoice for a vendor and then later make some modification to that vendor, we probably don't really, have concerns with that sequence of transactions. And looking for critical attributes, like on the previous example, is it over a certain dollar amount? Is it a particular process that's being followed that, doesn't have other mitigating activities in it, like approvals and things like that? So if we're going to take this example and go look for specific occurrences of this, we can hopefully bring down that giant stack of all invoices the user processed to just a very specific set of occurrences, which we would call, a true exception of the risk. So this whole concept is based around, exception-based SOD risk exposure, right? We just want to look at the instances where a user performs something that actually constitutes an exception or a violation of the defined SOD risk. So, like we said, there's lots of different SOD examples beyond the, specific one we just talked about. And when you start putting all of the different sets of results you get for all these different risks and juxtaposing it against each other, it can really give you a lot of insight. So if we're looking at, the left side of this chart, these are examples of can-do access conflicts, right? These are users that just have access to perform the conflicting functions, and the different risks here on the side, the different scenarios of combinations of access. So we see some pretty big, user counts, the individual conflicts of SODs, or, if we're counting it by the transaction code level, the number of conflicts can get quite alarming. And if we're just looking at, that big green box of transactions that the user might have occurred that relate to these SODs, they're massive transaction counts. It's more than anybody can wrap their arms around, and you immediately realize you have to start slicing and dicing it to get to some meaningful results. So then if we look at our, did do violations, right, the exception-based reporting, you can see that the number of users, typically drops dramatically, right? In this first example, there's 208 users that had access, but we only found 4 users that actually transacted on this. Or a step below here, you had the lowest number of actual conflicts at the, transaction code level, but resulting in the, largest financial impact of access here. So sometimes the access, analysis can be a little misleading in terms of what's really your, biggest impact that you might want to look into. You can also find, a particular user that might pop in this example that, didn't show up in the results in the access, and this is because your can-do access analysis is always a point in time extract, but obviously people's access changes all the time. So doing this type of exception-based reporting can sometimes capture real exceptions that occurred that you may not have been aware of based on just the access reporting. And then of course the best case example at the bottom is where you have a massive amount of access conflict and transactional exposure, but we go and do this exception-based analysis and we don't find anything that occurred. And that of course is the best case scenario. So a little bit about, a little bit of that level setting I think I wanted to do just to make sure everyone's aware of what these concepts are. We've done a lot of education over the years around that concept. But I want to spend a lot more time today on what kind of processes our clients use to implement this concept, and how do you go about it. So the real gold standard, right, of SOD management or access management is sort of having this two-prong approach, in our opinion, is having this preventive control of provisioning with SOD checking in place up front to serve as your preventive control over users actually getting access to the SOD. So, this is what you're using an SAP access control or another GRC tool type solution to do, integrating with your identity management platforms, right, as much as possible, requiring those approvals or documented mitigations up front so that you can do as much as you can to avoid people getting access to these SOD conflicts in your various business applications upfront. But of course, there's always business needs. There's always reasons that access will need to be retained or risks will need to be accepted or monitored. And that's really where this risk quantification comes in on the back end as your kind of detective control to provide that exception-based reporting and identify who has actually conducted these things, how many times, how much, and give you a work list of things to investigate and really make sure that the access is being used for what it needs to be used for, and there's nothing inappropriate occurring, and kind of provide that comfort level. So the approaches to actually performing this type of analysis, there's really two ways you can go. You can look back historically with kind of a point in time assessment. These are the scenarios where you might just need to go see what happened over a specific period of time. A lot of times this happens, as a result of a finding or, as part of an audit, to go and detect what's actually occurred. And there's lots of tools available to do this kind of stuff. You can build access databases and do things in ACL. There's all kinds of ways you can build these types of assessments. But there's also, the continuous monitoring approach where you implement a solution to monitor transactions that occur, over time and collect these exceptions in a platform that you can use to, get insights, find out what's happening, see what might be concerning and fine tune that process over time. So that's a little bit about, a solution like Pathlock has to offer, which I'll spend some time, diving into, especially in some of the case study examples coming up. As far as use cases in terms of when to do this, type of analysis, it's very heavily tied to remediation efforts in your SAP and other, application landscapes. So typically, this type of process is kicked off by, a finding or a reporting that shows that there's a lot of access conflict within the environment. So, before you even start on performing any of the remediation, is a good time to perform this type of analysis because you can really focus in on where you have the most financial impact of all that access in your environment. So this is like when we're looking at those examples on the table before, maybe there's a particular area that doesn't seem so bad based on the access analysis, but you find that it has a lot of financial exposure to it. That might be one to tackle quickly because, you have not that much to clean up, but it's resulting in a lot of conflict from a financial perspective. So, you can really assess how bad the overall issues are. And of course, in the middle here during a remediation or a redesign project, you can perform this analysis to do some substantive testing, especially when audit and compliance is involved. Typically monitoring the progress of the remediation. You can do this type of reporting to show what's occurring in the system, and even do some change management and some training to your end user base to educate them on what's the objectives of the company are, and try to reduce some of these things before you can clean it up from a technical perspective. And obviously after the go forward approach would be to continue monitoring the SODs that remain after you complete one of these initiatives, so you can continue staying on top of the access that's out there. So in the specific example of kind of looking forward and using a solution like the Pathlock AVM tool, the process for implementing a control for a particular SOD risk generally follows this type of implementation life cycle. The first step being here at the top of the wheel, being discovery and scoping. So selecting which SOD risks are presenting the most issue, either financially or operationally, zeroing in on what the specific scenario of that SOD is. So, when we think about carrying out this SOD risk, it's not just enough to think about the two functions that make up the SOD. You really need to think about what are the, specific T-codes, doc types that are used that present the most risk in the sequence of events, and really determine, which risks are important. And then, design and blueprint that based on all those requirements, and walk through those specific examples with your experts in your companies. Typically it's somebody, ideally there's someone in the IT organization that's functionally aware of the types of processes that are being used by the business, but often you do need to involve some business users to understand what the process is and what a scenario or an exception of the SOD might look like. So you want to look through, those types of examples, and also looking at the existing manual controls that are in your environment. So this is something we'll touch on a bit later too when it comes to developing our business case. But existing controls that are built into your processes can inform this type of automation or automated control design as well. So you can take advantage of certain criteria that's being used or certain areas of the process that might be well mitigated, and focus in on what you need to build into this monitoring control. And of course, there's a step of integrating. So with a solution like Pathlock's AVM tool, you need to install some plugins on your SAP or your other applications, and perform all those connections and validate that everything is integrating appropriately, as well as integrate with an identity source. So, if you're talking about cross-system risk scenarios, you want to make sure your identities are defined across the landscape, and integrate that as well. So that's a consideration to bring to the table if you're going to go forward with an implementation like this. As far as configuration, there's several layers to the AVM platform or solution. There's things you need to configure on the plugin in your SAP environment, specifically the filters and things that will be used as part of generating the function data for each of these different risk scenarios that get reported in the control output, and tying all these things together. So you define exactly what gets produced in the reports that the end users will eventually interact with. And then of course testing all of this. So coming around the other side of the wheel, unit testing and fine tuning through a UAT process, that reporting. So putting as many eyes on it as you can to identify what are true exceptions, what are useful points of information for users to eventually use as part of their review process, and then of course deploying that, running at the top, monitoring your production environments and having all the background jobs and everything scheduled and monitored with the appropriate teams, and beginning that sort of continuous monitoring process. So all these steps obviously go into a single risk control that you're deploying. Obviously you can deploy multiple risks at a time, and we'll look at some of what those different options look like on the next few slides. But this is generally the life cycle of a individual control as you roll it out. So in the first step there, if we back up to the beginning, was selecting your risks, and this is something that does take a fair bit of time. It's not like when we start with our with these projects with our clients that we immediately have our marching orders to go start work. It's really important to know which risks you want to go monitor, and that obviously informs both the tool selection process as well as how subscriptions and licensing and stuff is based when you deploy a solution like this. So working through this risk selection process is something we often do with our clients. Even before we start a project, is defining what exactly should be built into the solution. So you look at your access reporting, how many users are there that have these conflicts, right? We know you may find other things when we start looking at the exceptions, and maybe we do kind of a manual analysis to try to identify what might be defining, but as we know, that's difficult to quantify without a tool like this in place. So you do look at how much access there is in the different risks across the different environments that you may end up selecting to integrate, and then sort of transposing that against the library of controls that have already been built. Pathlock has a pretty extensive library of controls that have been automated for monitoring in the solution in the past. But there are always new scenarios that we identify for our clients, and looking at those and how they might lay out across your business processes can kind of help you in make an educated decision in terms of what to prioritize and roll out automation for. Another step in that wheel is defining what the process is going to look like going forward. So at a high level overall, how does the process for automating these controls with a tool like AVM work? If we start over on the left here, the first step is obviously defining which of the target systems are going to be monitored. So if we're looking at one SAP, environment, maybe there's some other integrations there, like an Ariba or another tool that has some cross-system risk. Make sure we discuss all those different risk scenarios. And as you step through this overall process, when that data is transferred to AVM, you want to think about how frequently do we need the data to be sent, and how frequently are reviews going to be performed. So that all kind of integrates with each other. It's a decision that affects kind of back to the first step. How often do we want to perform these reviews? That'll inform how often we need to set up these syncing jobs across the target applications and the AVM side, and thinking about who the particular administrators are going to be. So the earlier you can get these folks involved with the implementation process and start doing some of the knowledge transfer and how to manage the back end of this process, the more success you'll have in the future, of course. And then moving forward down the line, right, in this process, which SODs are in scope, right? That goes back to our risk selection example. But when the data is consumed and analyzed by AVM, for all these different risks, what's nice is you have this kind of two-pronged workflow here. If nothing is identified, no exceptions are identified, it kind of routes you through this swim lane here at the bottom, which is a nice way to show, and we'll look at some of this with the business case, but in AVM, you'll now have this kind of record of this control was performed and no violations were found for that particular SOD. And then kind of going down the line here, are there any auditors that will be involved in this overall process that would report that record, or any of the findings in the above that you want to talk to as well to make sure any of their concerns or interest in this whole process is brought to the table as you're defining this whole process. The upper swim lane here I want to talk about a little bit is if there are results, which most of the time we don't want there to be exceptions because that means that there's some risk to your company, but we also want to make sure that this solution that we're putting in place and building has value, right? And in most cases, that's going to be where there are access to SODs and there is some exceptions occurring. So it's really important to define a good process for this workflow here where exceptions are found. So kind of going into this box, which we'll dive in a little further on the next page, but you'll have the violations routed through a workflow to a particular control owner or manager that'll review all those exceptions, right? And so part of this process is identifying who those managers are going to be that will actually review these things. And then is there any oversight? So is there a compliance team or a governing body that will oversee this whole process of the manager review? And then, once all that activity is performed and the mitigation and the review of these exceptions is documented, it's all again stored in AVM for your auditors to be able to see. Anyone else involved with the process, they can go in and review the comments and attachments and things that were uploaded as part of the mitigation review for the future. So diving in a little bit more, I want to zero in on this dotted box for this next slide here. Kind of like what's an example of a review process that these managers would go through when they get the exception report. So to start, are there any reported exceptions in their inbox that they need to look at? If not, that's great. You document everything and it's stored in the application to be reviewed. But if there are exceptions, so now we step down the line here. The first question that we would want a manager to ask is, am I the appropriate person to review this? So there's a few options within AVM to divert or delegate your exceptions that are found. You can either have it sent to kind of a central team or sent to a particular user's manager. And where we define that user manager relationship can come from a variety of sources, but if there isn't always a reliable mapping of user to manager, sometimes exceptions get sent to somebody that doesn't actually understand the process, or they don't manage that user anymore. So a first step here might be for the user to look at the exception and say, this probably isn't for me to review, and you have the ability to delegate it to the appropriate person. Or you could potentially, bring it up to the compliance team if there's an oversight over the process for them to help you get that routed to the correct person. But if the answer is yes, or if it does get to the correct person, the next step might be to understand if there's a mitigating control or some review that's already been performed on that transaction. So, in that case, you can sometimes just link the exception to an existing control so that you can save time, and instead of going through the whole review process on that exception, you might say, oh, these are already covered by this other control that we have. But if there is no control in place, you'd obviously need to go in and look at all the transactions. In that case, or even if there is a control, you may want to look at if there's any residual risk that you need to evaluate. So look for suspicious items or any transactions that aren't covered by that control. Highlighted here is unusual users, right? If we're looking at a finance risk and there's somebody that works in inventory in a warehouse somewhere and we see them in the results, that should raise a red flag for us to look into that user a little bit more. Repetitive amounts, accounts that don't look accurate, things like that, you may want to highlight and dive into that a little bit further as well. And of course, the last step here, if you are using controls within this process to sort of assign exceptions or link exceptions to other controls that are already in place, make sure those controls are effective and that they've passed any SOX testing or other testing validation that's performed, because you wouldn't want to obviously link one of these controls and say they're covered by an existing, or one of these exceptions and say they're covered by an existing control if that control is not reliable for us. So really making sure that those controls are effective that we're using is very important. And then again, of course, everything is maintained here. Sometimes, and we'll look at an example of this process might not be the actual manager carrying this out. This might be a compliance someone coordinating this process. So if they need to eventually get a rationale or an approval from a manager or something, you could obtain that and then upload or maintain that in AVM as well. So there's a lot of options in this process, and this is just an example of the things we've seen our clients use as they work through this data. So real quickly, just implementation options. How do a lot of our clients go about doing these implementations? 3 high-level options here. Obviously, there's a lot of times where we land somewhere in between these, but from left to right, doing multiple rollouts by system, so kind of segmenting the applications you eventually want to integrate, focusing on one at a time. You can sometimes get things spun up quicker if you're focusing on just one application and kind of establish a continuous improvement process that way, but sometimes ends up with the longest timeline and cost of the overall deployment. In the middle here is sort of a release-based approach. So, if we think about the risk selection process, we're looking across our whole landscape. We focus in on maybe the top 50% or biggest chunk of percentage that we can in terms of the exposure, based on the access results for release one. So that might be one application or several applications, but we're using a bang for our buck approach to get as much covered as possible as quickly as possible. So this sort of helps us get deployed quickly. It may end up requiring more time from your business and IT leads over the course of this process, but generally a little bit lower cost and faster realization of the benefits than number one, by segmenting it just by system. And then of course at the end here, a big bang where we sort of work on everything in our overall life cycle, and then go live with everything across the landscape at once. So all your controls, all the systems, go live. Obviously this is difficult to sell usually, because there's a lot of work that needs to go in, and it's hard to kind of get the buy-in from the organization unless we're talking about a relatively small landscape to do these types of approaches, just because of the demand and the size of the project, typically to roll this all out, and of course the increased risk with rolling everything out at once. So that's sort of the kind of best practices, the things that we've seen our clients use, things that we've used to roll this type of automation out to our customers, clients. But I want to look at just some specific examples here and some case studies. So this first example, a Fortune 500 company, they had 35 critical SOD risks that they were monitoring across 2 different SAP instances, and they were hit with a significant deficiency around the amount of SOD access that was found in the production environments, which of course opens the door to potential financial impact. And they had a hard time determining how material the deficiency really was. So kind of a perfect example of some of the concepts we talked about here. But as a result of all the effort, to quantify the exceptions, the deficiency was reduced, and it actually helped the company develop a process, to investigating, actual instances of fraud that were found. So the overall approach, right? We scoped, exactly which SODs needed to be monitored, and which the in-scope company codes, plans, things like that were involved. Extracting all the data, into a tool that could manipulate it and analyze it for all those different SOD combinations, and running testing against those different combinations of access, and reporting this out into Excel-based reports to be investigated by the different business owners. And then, preparing all of that into a package to be consumed, by the external auditors, as well as the internal audit and various stakeholders, so that they could look at this at a high level and understand where the actual, potential areas of risks were, and where they really needed to follow up, and also highlight, where there was no concern. So if there, a lot of risks had a lot of access issues, but the processes didn't necessarily reflect that, so there wasn't a lot of risk to really investigate there. Some of the lessons learned, just to touch on briefly, because I want to be conscious of time here. It is a large volume of data to extract, so it sometimes takes several days to get all the data in this kind of approach. And again, here is using sort of a manual approach, or a point-in-time assessment tool, as opposed to a continuous solution like AVM. So there is a lot of extra sort of validation that needs to be performed to get auditors comfortable, and to educate people on the process. So definitely manually intensive process to do it this way. Another case study to look at here, this is a Fortune 150 company that deployed over 60 AVM controls across a couple of ECC and S/4HANA instance. Very big, global company, and kind of deployed this in a centrally managed way. So they rolled out all these controls being reported to a central team that then worked with the various business owners to determine what was applicable. And this approach was actually kind of hybrid, where we did use some assessment tools before the SOD remediation took place. They were doing a lot of different, access governance initiatives at the time. So we continued to do that throughout their whole redesign process, and then actually deployed AVM for them to have this additional monitoring going forward as a continuous process. So here's a look at the overall timeline. Initially doing some quarterly quantification reviews while this access control and security work was being done, and then eventually transitioned to a more frequent review of exceptions, thanks to the AVM tool being able to report things much more quickly and efficiently than the manual approach, and kind of deploying this, at the end developing this playbook that the internal financial controls team was able to use to determine what types of exceptions were material, what was relevant, where did they need to involve business owners in, so they continued to learn as they worked with their different business owners what were important exceptions and what was not, to really develop this ongoing process. Just some of the benefits, high level, realized that because they were able to do this, with both approaches, right? Looking at things, in a consistent way, I think is a big one to highlight, because look, the manual reviews, it's all different tables and all different things you need to pull and join up together to get exceptions. But being able to pull it, with the same types of, clicks and scheduled jobs and things happening in AVM to get the data in one place consistently is a really big benefit to highlight. And a big one at the end here in terms of lessons learned, it is all continuous improvement. So as the team learns the different exceptions, as they work with the business more and learns more about this, the rule set is constantly changing, and the different rules and conditions that are being used by AVM to generate risks can continue to get tweaked and refined, and fine-tuned as they go along. And finally, number 3 here, another case study. So, by revenue, Fortune 15 company, very big company, very large, diverse landscape of applications, rolling out, as a target over 80 AVM controls across this whole 6-year process, and over 300. I think we're up, 400 or 500 numbers now of business owners that have been enabled on the AVM platform to do this review. So, over the years, this started as kind of a proof of concept, and this company was relatively mature in terms of their SOD management processes, prior to looking at AVM, but now has allowed them to kind of go to that next level and deploy these controls across all their landscape, and with their new initiatives coming down the lane, adopting AVM into the new applications they'll be rolling out in the future as well, is an ongoing initiative. And their process kind of consists of these business managers that are out in the field that know the transactions and understand what their users are doing, and a compliance team over here on the right that knows the risks and the rule set and can kind of help identify the right managers or users to perform the reviews as the exceptions are reported, and kind of work together to make sure the data gets to the right people and the exceptions are closed, and that the overall process is completed in the end to end. So twice a year they perform this review, where they look at all of the SOD results and sort of certify if people need to retain or they can remove that access, and then perform this look back in AVM to do this exception-based reporting and sign off on the actual transactions and confirm that those are appropriate and maintain all that evidence for their auditors. So, this is a very advanced and mature process that's been rolled out and continues to be, refined. So quickly here, we're coming down to the wire on time, but developing a business case, when I hear business case, I typically think of ROI and sort of selling the bottom line of a solution like this, or automate, how do we sell the fact that this process needs to be automated. So the key kind of ingredients to this discussion are: what's the total cost of ownership, right? What is going to what's going to cost to implement this tool and to maintain it going forward, and the controls themselves. How many are we going to do? What's going to be the benefit achieved? And then what is the current process that we're improving? So how many people are involved in that process? How do we quantify what's being done today? So typically what you're looking at with automating this is how much does it cost to run our controls right now, and once we automate it, how much cheaper is it going to be, and how much less resource drain is it going to affect on our people once this is in place. And of course, all the incremental costs to get there, all go into this equation. Obviously, determining, how many risks you can cover, looking at your rule set. If you don't have a rule set or these kind of controls in place, sometimes, you start a little bit before this and assess what risks really apply to your organization and bring them to the table and identify what you can automate and what will give you the most impact. And then dropping this all on a roadmap, right? So maybe year one, for example, we deploy 20 controls on a particular system, automate this, quickly to understand some of the benefits, kind of pilot it or do a proof of concept in year one, but year two really, aggressively expand all the coverage and bring more people on board to achieve this, do some more controls, and year three, continue to roll that out and look at a break-even point kind of somewhere in year three. Is it just an example of how you might lay out the business case for rolling out a solution like this? So next steps, what do you want to do with your organization? The things I would recommend thinking about, right, is who owns SOD in your organization. So getting this kind of process moving, a lot of it depends on who SOD management falls with. A lot of times it's on the IT organization, which is challenging because you may not know what these different business risks mean, and a lot of times it's sort of just requirements that come from the business that IT just carries out. So it's hard to make the next steps happen if it's owned by the IT organization. But if you can push some of that responsibility out to the business and show here's all the financial impact of all the SOD that's out there, you can get the business to kind of own it more and potentially move towards putting a process like this in place. And how is it currently managed? What type of overhead is involved in mitigating the SOD access that's there right now? So that's definitely a big one in terms of calculating ROI. But if there's findings in fraud, that is typically the event that triggers this type of project to be put underway. So if something like that's happened at your organization, then that could be the impetus for something like this to happen. But continuous improvement of your processes is something that this really helps and kind of drives the whole organization forward in terms of we really need to clean up this access, or we need to get a handle on what's actually happening in our environments. And focusing in on these real exceptions, the little box here at the bottom right, is a great first step to help you save time and not kind of drown in a massive amount of data and potential conflict, and focus in on this. So that is all I have here. I will turn it back over to you, Stephanie, for our wrap up or our Q&A we're going to open up for, if we have any questions.
Thank you, John, for that presentation. Again, if you do have any questions, please add them now into the questions box. I'm not seeing any questions right now, so I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and we hope to see you at future webinar events.